On the 29th of July, 1981, 750 million people watched a shy young Englishwoman marry the heir to the throne, and they believed it was a love story. But the marriage was already in trouble before the wedding. Before the vows, there was a third person in it, a bride starving herself from 29 inches to 23 and a half, and a bracelet she said she found 2 weeks before the wedding, which she believed had been meant for another woman. What the world was sold as a fairy tale was a fiction, kept upright for a decade, because the crown needed the performance more than the two people trapped inside it. This is how that fiction was built, and what it cost the girl of 19 who was placed at its centre. If you are drawn to the secrets the crown tried hardest to bury, subscribe to Silenced Crown and stay with me. What follows is not the wedding the country remembers, but the marriage they actually lived. Chapter 1. The girl the palace went looking for. She grew up a tenant on the Queen's own Norfolk land, a shy Spencer child no one ever imagined would one day divide a monarchy. Diana Frances Spencer was born on the 1st of July 1961 at Park House, a rented home on the edge of the Sandringham estate in Norfolk. The house stood on the Queen's own land, and that single fact tells you almost everything about the world she was born into. The Spencers were not minor gentry who had wandered by accident into the royal orbit. They were one of the oldest and grandest families in England, seated for centuries at Althorpe, closer to the throne by blood and by service than many families who wore grander titles. Diana's father, Edward John Spencer, then Viscount Althorpe, and later the 8th Earl Spencer, had served as an equerry to two monarchs, to King George VI and then to Queen Elizabeth II, before his daughter was ever thought of as a bride. To grow up a Spencer was to grow up inside the machinery of the crown, near enough to see how it worked, and near enough to be chosen by it. She was the fourth of 5 children, and she arrived into a marriage that was already quietly failing. When Diana was 6 years old, in 1967, her mother, Frances, left. The divorce that followed was bitter and public in the way that aristocratic divorces of that period could be, fought over the children and remembered by them for the rest of their lives. Diana carried the wound of it a long way. A child who watches her own parents' marriage break, who is shuttled between them and made the subject of their quarrel, learns early that the adults who are supposed to protect her cannot always be relied upon to stay. That lesson went down deep in her, and it left a young woman who craved, more than anything, to be wanted and to be kept. It is one of the quiet tragedies of the whole story that the marriage she would eventually make gave her the exact reverse of both. Those who knew her as a girl describe a child who was warm and shy in equal measure, not academic, quick to cry and quick to comfort, and above all, devoted to small children long before she had any of her own. As a girl on the Sandringham estate, she had played with the younger royal sons, with Prince Andrew and Prince Edward, so that the family she would one day marry into was not entirely a set of strangers. It was, in a sense, the family down the drive. She had grown up in the long shadow of the great house, a tenant's daughter on royal ground, close enough to the crown to be familiar with its rhythms and yet entirely outside its true machinery. That in-between position, near the throne but not of it, was exactly the kind of background the institution prized in a bride. By the time the courtship became serious, she was leading the mildest imaginable version of an adult life. She was sharing a rented flat in London with friends. She was working as a nursery assistant at the Young England kindergarten in Pimlico, minding other people's children for a modest wage, and the press, once they found her, gave her the nickname that stuck for the rest of her life. They called her Shy Di. The name was accurate. She blushed, she looked at the pavement, she held a small child on her hip while the cameras clicked, and the country decided in an instant that it had found something it wanted. She was not a woman with a career, a fortune, or a public role. She was a 19-year-old who liked children and lived quietly, and that ordinariness, set against the grandeur of her family name, was precisely what made her irresistible to a nation waiting for a princess. To understand why the palace went looking for a girl like this, you have to see the man she was being measured against, and the pressure that surrounded him. Charles Philip Arthur George had been born on the 14th of November 1948 at Buckingham Palace, the eldest child of the then Princess Elizabeth. He became heir apparent at his mother's accession in February 1952, when he was 3 years old. He was created Prince of Wales in 1958 and invested with great ceremony at Caernarfon in 1969. He was educated at Cheam, at Gordonstown, and at Trinity College, Cambridge, and he served as an officer in the Royal Air Force and the Royal Navy in the early 1970s. By the year 1980, he was 31 years old, still unmarried, and under a pressure that had been building for the better part of a decade. That pressure had a shape, and the shape was older than either of them. The heir to the British throne was not expected to marry for himself. He was expected to marry for the succession, to choose a bride the institution could present to the country without a single awkward question attached. She had to be young. She had to be unimpeachable. In the calculations of the age she had, ideally, to be a Protestant girl of good family with no history the newspapers could dig up, and no former lovers who might one day sell a story. Diana Spencer answered every one of those requirements as if she had been designed for them. She was 19, she was a Spencer, she was Protestant, and she was believed by the palace to be entirely without a past. From the point of view of the institution, she was not a person who had been fallen in love with. She was a solution that had been found. That distinction between a person loved and a solution found is the seed of everything that follows, and it is worth holding on to. A dynastic monarchy does not, at bottom, exist to make its members happy. It exists to continue. The first duty of an heir is to secure the line, and a marriage, in that calculation, is a mechanism of the succession before it is anything else. For 3 centuries, the House of Windsor and its predecessors had arranged the marriages of heirs with exactly this logic, weighing suitability, religion, and reputation far above the private feelings of the 2 people involved. Diana entered a tradition that had valued the appearance of a marriage over its reality for longer than anyone could remember, and she entered it as its most valuable asset in a generation, chosen for how perfectly she fitted the requirement. And here is the asymmetry that the whole of this story turns on. The crack that was there in the foundation before a single stone of the fairy tale was laid. On one side of this marriage stood a man in his 30s. He had a decade of adult life behind him, a fixed inner world, settled habits, and a household of staff who were loyal to him and had been for years. On the other side stood a teenager who had never held a job of any consequence, who had lived in a shared flat, and who knew almost nothing of the man she was marrying or the vast, cold machine she was marrying into. She was not his equal in age, in experience, in worldliness, or in protection. She was not close to being his equal in any of them. From the institution's point of view, none of that was a problem. It was, if anything, the point. A young, unformed, unattached girl was easier to present and easier to place than a woman with a life of her own. The crown got precisely what it went looking for: a suitable and successful match on paper, a grand and unimpeachable bride of proven family and expected fertility. What the crown did not weigh, because it had never been in the habit of weighing such things, was what that same asymmetry would do to the 2 human beings once the cameras were switched off and the doors were shut. The very qualities that made Diana the perfect choice for the institution, her youth, her innocence, her lack of any world of her own, were the qualities that would leave her most exposed inside the marriage. She had been chosen for her softness. It was her softness that the years ahead would break. And the man she was about to be handed to was already, quietly, in love with somebody else. Chapter 2. A courtship the country decided first. They had met perhaps a dozen times when the whole of Britain began planning a wedding that neither of them had yet agreed to. The story that the country told itself was of a romance. The truth was thinner than that, and faster, and stranger. Charles and Diana are generally reckoned to have met properly for the first time in 1977, and the circumstance of that meeting is one of the small, sharp ironies the whole marriage is full of. He was, at the time, briefly involved with Diana's own elder sister, Sarah. Diana was 16, a schoolgirl in the background of somebody else's courtship, and to the prince, at that point, barely more than that. She was the younger Spencer girl, the shy one, the one who was not the point. It would be 3 more years before he looked at her again, and when he did, the country looked with him. Through the year 1980, the acquaintance grew into something the newspapers could photograph. And once the newspapers had it, the pace of the thing left the 2 people at the centre of it far behind. This is the fact that is easiest to lose beneath the wedding footage, and it is one of the most important facts in the story. Biographers reckon that Charles had met Diana only around a dozen times before he proposed to her. A dozen meetings. Not a dozen years, not a dozen months of quiet courtship, but roughly 12 occasions on which these 2 people had been in a room together before a decision was taken that would bind them for life and put one of them on a course towards the throne. Whatever else the marriage was, it was not the fruit of a long knowing of one person by another. They were, in the most literal sense, near strangers on the day the engagement was announced. While those 12 meetings were happening, the country was not waiting patiently to see how a romance developed. The country had already decided. The press encampment outside the Young England kindergarten became a permanent fixture. Photographers followed her to her car, to the shops, to the flat she shared with her friends. A single photograph of her, taken outside the kindergarten where she worked, could run around the world overnight and turn a private nursery assistant into public property. The newspapers speculated endlessly about an engagement that had not yet been announced. A shy 19-year-old, who had done nothing but mind other people's children, found her face on the front pages every morning, and the whole apparatus of national attention swung round to point at her and to demand that she become the thing it had already decided she was. There is a cruelty in this that has nothing to do with either Charles or Diana as individuals, and it belongs to the machinery of the age. A country that had waited years for its heir to marry had worked itself into a state of appetite, and when a suitable girl finally appeared, that appetite fixed on her with a force that made refusal almost unthinkable. She could not step back, because the cameras would not step back. She could not take her time, because the country had run out of patience on her behalf. The pressure that had been sitting on the 31-year-old prince for a decade was transferred, in a matter of months, onto the shoulders of a teenager who had no staff, no experience, and no protection of her own. The wedding was being planned in the newspapers before the proposal had been made in private, and the young woman at the centre of it had no machinery whatever to hold the tide back. The weight of what was being asked of her is difficult to hold in the mind. She was 19 years old. She had left school without distinction, and had never wanted a career grander than working with small children. She had no fortune of her own to fall back on, no public role, and no training whatever for the life she was being pulled towards. And she was being asked to become, in the space of a single year, the future Queen of England. the most photographed woman on earth, and the wife of a man she had met a dozen times and did not really know. The institution that was drawing her in was 300 years old and ran on machinery she could not begin to see. She could see only the man, and even the man she could not see clearly, because the country would not give her the quiet in which to look. It is worth pausing on what the press pursuit alone did to her, because it set the pattern for the rest of her life. From the moment she was identified as the likely bride, Diana lost the ordinary privacy that every other person her age took for granted. She could not leave her flat without being photographed. She could not drive to work without a convoy of cars behind her. Reporters interviewed her flatmates, her friends, anyone who had ever known her, hunting for the smallest detail. The girl who had blushed at attention was made, overnight, into the single most watched young woman in the country, and she was made into it before she had agreed to anything, before there was a ring or a date or a vow. The hunger of the press for her image, which the palace would later find so useful, began by simply hunting her, and it never truly stopped hunting her, from that first winter to the last night of her life. What almost nobody watching understood was that the man himself was being pressed just as hard, only from a different direction and towards the same end. Charles was not a free agent gliding towards a love match of his own choosing. He was an heir under a decade of accumulated pressure to marry and to secure the line, watching the newspapers turn a young woman he barely knew into a national expectation. He would find it very difficult to disappoint. His position had its own kind of trap. Every year he remained unmarried was a year of speculation and of quiet reproach, a reminder that the first duty of the heir was undone. A suitable girl had now appeared. The press had crowned her. The family approved, and the machinery of expectation closed around him just as it closed around her. So the courtship that the country believed it was witnessing, a prince falling in love and choosing his bride, was in truth something closer to two people being carried on the same fast current, each of them watched, each of them pressed, neither of them entirely free to stop. She was too young and too exposed to resist it. He was too dutiful and too watched to escape it. The romance existed chiefly in the imagination of a hopeful public, projected onto two figures who were, in private, far less certain than the fairy tale required. The plainest measure of how little they knew each other is the arithmetic of their meetings. By the reckoning of the biographers, Charles had been in Diana's company on only around a dozen occasions before he asked her to marry him. A dozen meetings, spread across a courtship the newspapers had inflated into a national love affair. There had been no long companionship in which two people learn each other's habits and moods, no slow discovery of whether they were suited. There had been a handful of encounters, a mounting press frenzy, and a country's impatience. And out of those thin materials, a lifelong marriage was being assembled. A girl of 19 was being asked to promise herself forever to a man she had met a dozen times. And the country, which knew even less about the pair than they knew about each other, was already certain it was witnessing a great romance. And the current was about to arrive at a letter, written by the prince's own father, that would take even the appearance of choice away and turn the drift of a courtship into the fixed fact of an engagement. Chapter 3. The letter that forced the question. A letter from his father reached the heir that winter, and it offered him a choice that was not really a choice at all. By the closing weeks of 1980, the situation had become intolerable to everyone except the newspapers who were feeding on it. Diana was being pursued relentlessly. Her reputation, in the language of the time, was said to be at risk simply because the press would not leave her alone. And every week that passed without a decision was a week in which the speculation grew louder and the young woman at the center of it was left more exposed. Something had to give, and what gave, according to the authorized account, was a letter. Here the story must be told with care, because it is one of the most quoted moments in the whole marriage, and it is also one of the most easily distorted. The source for it is Jonathan Dimbleby's biography of Charles, published on the 3rd of November 1994, with the prince's own cooperation and with access to his private journals and letters. According to that authorized account, Prince Philip wrote to his son during this period, urging him to make up his mind. The substance of the letter, as Dimbleby records it, was that Charles should either propose to Diana or release her, and that he should do so before further delay damaged her reputation. That is the documented shape of it, and it is reported, not quoted, because the letter itself has never been made public, and no one outside the family has ever set down its exact words. It was not, so far as the record allows anyone to say, a cruel or a bullying letter. It was a father telling his son that the young woman could not be left dangling in the glare of the press indefinitely, and that the decent course was to decide. But the letter did not land in a neutral place, and this is where the true weight of it lies. Charles, by Dimbleby's account, read his father's words not as advice, but as an ultimatum. He felt pressed. He felt that the choice was being taken out of his hands, that he was being maneuvered towards a marriage he was not emotionally ready for by the combined force of his family, the press, and the expectations of the throne. And whatever the exact wording of the letter, the effect on the prince is what matters to the marriage. He proposed to Diana in February 1981, feeling, on his own later testimony, that he had been given very little room to do anything else. The meaning of that, for the foundation of a marriage, is hard to overstate. The proposal at the very heart of the fairy tale, the moment the whole country was waiting for, was made by a man who felt he was being pushed into it. Not a man swept away, not a man certain, but a man who experienced the decision as pressure applied from outside. A marriage rests, in the ordinary way of things, on two people freely choosing one another. This one rested, on the husband's side, on a sense of obligation and constraint, and on the wife's side, on the romantic hopes of a 19-year-old who could not see what the man beside her was feeling. Two people were being joined, and neither of them was joining the other for the reasons the country imagined. The engagement was announced on the 24th of February 1981 at Buckingham Palace. It is worth correcting a small error that has crept into many careless tellings, which give the date as the 6th of February. It was the 24th. Diana wore a ring that would become one of the most famous pieces of jewellery in the world, a large sapphire encircled by small diamonds, chosen from the royal jeweller Garrard. She was 19 years old. He was 32, and the ring, for all its beauty, sat on the finger of a girl who was marrying a man pressed towards her, and who was himself, on his own later account, already emotionally attached elsewhere. The photographs from that day show a radiant young woman and a composed older man, and the country read them as the beginning of a love story. Only one of the two people in the photographs believed that is what it was. Set the plain figures of the match beside one another, and the imbalance is stark. He was 32 years old. She was 19. He had been heir to the throne since the age of 3, created Prince of Wales at the age of 9, invested with full ceremony at Caernarfon at the age of 20. He had met her, by the reckoning of his own biographers, on around a dozen occasions before he proposed. The sapphire on her finger was encircled by small diamonds from the royal jeweller Garrard, and the wedding they were now committed to would be watched, 5 months later, by some 750 million people around the world. A girl of 19 was being fitted, in a matter of weeks, for the largest role on earth. And here the trap that held Charles is worth naming, because it explains why a man who felt so little certainty went ahead at all. The heir to the throne does not enjoy the freedom of an ordinary bachelor to court slowly, to change his mind, to wait until he is sure. His first duty, the duty the whole institution exists to serve, is to secure the succession, and a suitable marriage is the instrument of that duty before it is a matter of the heart. He was 32 and unmarried, and every year that passed was counted against him. A suitable girl had appeared. The press had crowned her. His father had pressed him. The family approved. To refuse now, to release her after the country had already decided, would have been to invite a scandal of a different kind, and to leave the young woman herself disgraced by the association. The machinery had arranged matters so that the honourable course and the reluctant course were the same course, and it led straight to the altar. He was not a free man, choosing freely. He was an heir, doing his duty, and telling himself, perhaps, that affection would follow. On the evidence of his own words on the engagement day, he was not at all sure that it would. Then came the moment that has haunted the story ever since, and it happened in front of the cameras on the day of the engagement itself. The couple sat together for a television interview, the sort of gentle, celebratory piece the occasion demanded, and the interviewer asked them whether they were in love. Diana answered at once, and without hesitation. "Of course," she said. And Charles, beside her, added 4 words that would follow him for the rest of his life. "Whatever in love means," he said. It is impossible to overstate how much those 4 words contain. To the girl of 19 sitting beside him, who believed with her whole heart that she was stepping into a love story, the remark was a small catastrophe. She said later that it traumatized her. To the watching country, it was a strange, cold little note, struck at the happiest of moments, quickly smoothed over and half forgotten in the rush of celebration. But it was, in its way, the most honest thing said in the entire courtship. A man of 32, asked on his engagement day whether he loved the woman he was about to marry, could not bring himself to say yes without turning the word over like a philosopher and holding it at arm's length. The country heard eccentricity. What it was actually hearing was the truth, spoken aloud and then buried under a wedding. That single remark is the whole marriage in miniature, and it is why it has never been forgotten. The gap it revealed, between what the country believed and what the man felt, between the fairy tale on the surface and the reserve underneath, was the gap the marriage would live inside for the next 15 years. Diana heard it too, of course, and she carried it. A bride who has been told, in effect, on the day of her engagement, that her future husband is not sure what love even is, walks towards her wedding, carrying a doubt that no dress and no cathedral can quite cover. The engagement was set. The date was fixed. And 2 weeks before that wedding, in the office of one of the prince's own aides, Diana would open a parcel that she said told her exactly where all of this was going. Chapter 4. A fairy tale built for the cameras. On her wedding morning, the world saw a fairy tale, and only a handful of people inside the cathedral knew what it was hiding. The wedding of Charles and Diana took place on the 29th of July, 1981, and by every measure of spectacle, it was the largest royal production of the age. It was held not at Westminster Abbey, the traditional setting for such occasions, but at St. Paul's Cathedral, and the choice was itself a statement of scale. St. Paul's offered more seats and a longer processional route, more room for the pageantry, more distance for the bride to walk in her enormous gown while the cameras drank it in. Around 3,500 guests filled the cathedral. Outside, the crowds pressed along the route in their hundreds of thousands. And beyond the crowds, watching on television around the world, was an audience estimated at some 750 million people. It was, at the time, one of the most watched events in the history of the world. Every detail was built to be seen. Diana was carried to the cathedral in the glass coach, the closed state carriage that let the crowd see the bride inside. Her gown, designed by David and Elizabeth Emanuel, was a great confection of ivory silk with a train that ran to roughly 25 feet, so long that it filled the aisle behind her and had to be arranged and rearranged by her attendants as she moved. The dress alone was a piece of theatre, a thing built for the long walk and the wide shot, and when the bride emerged from the coach and the train unfolded behind her, the collective intake of breath was, in a sense, the entire point of the exercise. This was a fairy tale designed and lit and staged for an audience of 750 million, and on its own terms, it succeeded completely. The numbers of that single day give the measure of the machine at work. 3,500 guests inside the cathedral, some 750 million watching around the world. A train of 25 feet trailing behind a bride of 20, a closed glass coach chosen so that the crowds could see her, a groom of 32 waiting at the altar of the largest cathedral in the country. Every one of those figures was a decision, and every decision pointed the same way, towards spectacle, towards visibility, towards the manufacture of an image so vast that it could be seen from one end of the earth to the other. This was not a private sacrament witnessed by a few. It was a public product, engineered for the widest possible audience, and it was, on the day, the most successful such product the institution had ever made. There is a reason a modern monarchy invests so much in a spectacle like this, and it goes to the heart of how the crown survives at all. A monarchy that no longer rules must instead be loved, and it earns that love through ceremony, through the great set-piece occasions that gather the country around a shared image of itself. A royal wedding is the most powerful of these, a piece of national theatre that turns a private family into a public possession and renews the bond between the throne and the people who fund it. The marriage of Charles and Diana was the grandest such renewal in a generation, a deliberate act of public reassurance, and the institution poured its whole genius for pageantry into making it perfect. That is precisely why what lay underneath could never be admitted. The wedding was not only a celebration, it was an investment made in the sight of 750 million people, and an investment that large cannot be written off. The image had to be protected, whatever happened to the two people who had been placed at the center of it. There was even a small human flaw that only made the fairy tale more beloved. During the vows, the nervous young bride transposed the princes' names, promising herself to Philip Charles Arthur George rather than Charles Philip Arthur George. The country adored her for it. It was the slip of a girl overwhelmed by the size of the day, and it made her real and touching, in a way that the perfect pageantry around her never could. The Archbishop spoke of the stuff of which fairy tales are made. The couple appeared on the balcony of Buckingham Palace, and the kiss they shared there, in front of the roaring crowd, became one of the defining images of the entire century. On the surface of it, nothing was missing, and the whole country went to bed that night, believing it had witnessed the beginning of a great love. But the surface is not where this story lives, and to see the wedding truly, you have to know what a handful of people inside that cathedral already knew. Among the 3,500 guests, seated in the congregation in a dress of grey and pink, was Camilla Parker Bowles. She was married to a household cavalry officer named Andrew Parker Bowles, whom she had wed on the 4th of July 1973, and she had been close to Prince Charles since the early 1970s. Diana knew she was there. Diana said afterwards that she picked her out among the faces as she came up the aisle, that she saw her and knew what she represented, and that she carried the knowledge of it up the aisle of St. Paul's on the morning she was supposed to be the happiest woman in the world. The bride who slipped on the prince's names was also a bride watching for one particular face in the crowd and finding it. This is the gap that the whole of this film lives inside, and the wedding is the purest example of it that the story offers. On one side, there is the image, 750 million people, a 25-foot train, a glass coach, a balcony kiss, an archbishop invoking fairy tales. On the other side, there is the reality, a 19-year-old who believed her husband loved another woman, watching for that woman in the pews 2 weeks after finding a parcel she said confirmed it. The two things were happening at the very same moment, in the very same building, and only one of them was being broadcast to the world. The other, the true one, was known to almost no one, and it would stay hidden, by design, for years. And here is the thing that makes the wedding not merely sad, but structurally cruel. The point that carries forward into everything that follows. The scale of the public sale was precisely what would later have to be maintained. When an institution sells a marriage to 750 million people as a fairy tale, it cannot afterwards simply admit that the marriage has failed. The image is too large to take down quietly. The bigger the fiction the country was handed on the 29th of July 1981, the more elaborate the machinery would have to be to keep pretending in the years to come that the fiction was real. A small private wedding can end in a quiet, private divorce. A wedding watched by 750 million people becomes a debt, an obligation, a performance that has to be sustained long after the thing it depicts has died. So the wedding was the beginning of the marriage, and it was also, in the same instant, the beginning of the performance. The girl who walked up that aisle, watching for another woman's face, had just become the leading player in a production that would run for 15 years, whether the marriage underneath it survived or not. She had been chosen for the part precisely because she was young and soft and pliable. And now the part had begun, in front of the largest audience in history, on the grandest stage the country could build. It would not survive this marriage. And the first proof of that had already come to her, in a plain parcel, 2 weeks before she ever reached the altar. Chapter 5. The parcel she was never meant to see. 2 weeks before the wedding, Diana said, she opened a parcel in an aide's office and understood everything at once. Everything that follows in this chapter rests on Diana's own account, given years later through the writer Andrew Morton, and it must be held exactly there as her testimony and not as a proven fact, because the other person in it has never confirmed a word of it and is now the king. With that firmly in place, here is what she said happened. About 2 weeks before the wedding, she was in the office of one of Charles's aides, a man named Michael Colborne, when she came upon a parcel. She opened it. Inside was a bracelet, a gold chain with a small blue enamel disc, and on the disc were engraved 2 letters. The letters were G and F. To anyone else, the initials would have meant nothing at all. To Diana, they meant a great deal, because she believed she knew what they stood for. G and F, she said, were for Gladys and Fred, the private, teasing nicknames that Charles and Camilla used for one another. And so, standing in an aide's office a fortnight before her wedding, holding a piece of jewellery, she believed her future husband had commissioned for another woman. The girl of 19 understood, or believed she understood, the whole architecture of the marriage she was about to enter. "I know where this is going," she said. And in that one sentence lay the entire story of the next 15 years. The line between what is documented and what is not has to be drawn cleanly here, because this is precisely the kind of moment where a careless telling does real damage. That there was a bracelet, that the initials were G and F, that Charles gave it to Camilla, that the nicknames meant what Diana said they meant. All of this is Diana's allegation and Diana's alone. Charles has never confirmed it. The reading of the initials is her reading. Every element of the scene comes to the world through a woman describing, after the marriage had failed, the moment she says she first knew it would. It may be exactly true. It may be shaped by hindsight and by hurt. What cannot honestly be done is to state it as flat fact, and so it is carried here as what it is, the thing Diana said she found, and the meaning Diana said she took from it. But even held at that careful distance, the story tells you something entirely real, and the something is this. Whatever the truth of the bracelet, Diana went up the aisle of St. Paul's, believing that her marriage already contained a third person. That belief was the reality she lived inside, regardless of what a court of evidence could ever prove about a piece of jewellery. She had watched for Camilla's face in the congregation, and found it. She had, on her own account, held the evidence of the attachment in her own hands a fortnight before the wedding, and she married him anyway, because at 19, with the whole weight of the country pressing down on her, with the dress made and the cathedral booked, and 750 million people expecting a bride, there was, in any sense that mattered, no longer a way to stop. This is the point at which sympathy for her becomes almost unbearable. A grown woman with a life of her own, faced with what Diana said she was faced with, might have walked away. A woman of 30 with her own money and her own career and her own settled sense of herself might have handed back the ring and weathered the storm. Diana had none of those things. She was a teenager. She had no fortune, no profession, no power, and no experience of standing against the combined will of a family, a press, and a throne. She had been chosen by the institution precisely because she had none of those defenses, and so the very softness that had made her the perfect bride left her without any means of refusing the marriage even after she believed she had seen, in a plain parcel, exactly what it would cost her. The contrast between the scale of the celebration and the smallness of that private truth is the cruelty of her position laid bare. Around her, the machine was building the largest wedding of the age. 750 million people would watch. 3,500 guests would fill the cathedral. A train of 25 feet was being sewn. The whole country was counting down to the day. And the young woman at the centre of all of it was carrying a piece of knowledge that she believed poisoned the whole thing, a piece of knowledge she could tell no one, because to speak it would be to shatter a national celebration that had already grown far too large to stop. The bigger the fairy tale grew around her, the more alone she became inside it, and the more impossible it became to say the one true thing she knew. The detail of where she said she found the parcel is quietly revealing, and it is worth dwelling on for a moment. It was in the office of one of Charles's own aides, Michael Colborne, a member of the household that served the prince. This was the world Diana was marrying into, a world of private secretaries and equerries and aides whose loyalty was to him, formed around him, in place long before she arrived. She had no such household of her own. She was 19, and she was walking, effectively alone, into an institution staffed at every level by people whose first duty was to her husband and to the crown, not to her. The parcel in the aide's office is a small emblem of that larger truth. Even the evidence of her husband's other attachment reached her through his staff in his part of the machine, on ground that was entirely his and not at all hers. And there is the matter of what the palace believed it had chosen, which makes the private reality more painful still. Diana had been selected in part because she was thought to be a girl entirely without a past, unblemished, uncomplicated, the safe and suitable bride the succession required. The institution had vetted her for her innocence and found it satisfactory. What the institution had not thought to weigh was whether the man it was marrying her to came to the union just as unencumbered, and by Diana's account he did not. So the vetting ran entirely one way. The bride was examined for any hidden entanglement and found clean. The groom's own long attachment was simply not the institution's concern, because the institution's concern was the succession and the image, and both were served by the match regardless of what the groom felt or whom he loved. A girl was checked for a past she did not have, and married to a man whose past she said she found engraved on a bracelet, and the machine that had arranged all of it saw nothing that needed to be stopped. There is a further meaning in the bracelet that will run right to the end of this story, and it is a pattern more than an object. The bracelet is the first appearance of a shape that will repeat in different forms for the whole of the marriage. A hidden thing, a private truth, a woman kept just out of sight, and a fiction maintained over the top of all of it for the benefit of the watching world. The bracelet is where the pattern begins. Diana said she held it in her hands, understood what it meant, and married him regardless. And what she could not have known, standing in that office with the small gold chain in her palm, was that the woman she believed it was made for would still be there at the very end of the story, long after Diana herself was gone, and would one day wear a crown. That is where this was going. Diana said she knew it in an instant. It would take the rest of the country 15 years to catch up. And the first person the knowledge would injure was Diana herself, in her own body, in the months before the wedding. Chapter 6. The Body That Kept the Secret. The wedding dress had to be taken in again and again, and the reason was not a diet, but a marriage already making her ill. The public saw a bride growing more beautiful as the wedding approached. What was actually happening to Diana's body in the months before the wedding was something much darker, and again the account is her own, given through Andrew Morton, and carried here as her testimony. By her own telling, her bulimia began during the engagement, in the very period the country believed to be the happiest of her life. She traced it, she said, to a remark, something about being a bit chubby, dropped into a moment when she was already frightened and unsure of herself. And from that period, the illness took hold, with a speed that shows in a single, terrible measurement. Between February and July of 1981, the 5 months of her engagement, her waist went from 29 inches to 23.5. Sit with that number, because it is one of the most eloquent facts in the whole story. 5.5 inches, gone from a young woman's waist in 5 months. In the run-up to the wedding, the world was calling a fairy tale. The dress that had to be taken in again and again was not being adjusted for a bride glowing with happiness. It was being adjusted for a 19-year-old who was making herself ill, whose body was registering, in the plainest possible physical terms, a distress that the smiling photographs were built to hide. The public saw a slimming bride. The reality was an eating disorder taking root in a frightened girl, and the reality left its record not in any document, but in the shrinking measurements of her own waist, taken and retaken by the dressmakers as the great day approached. An eating disorder is, among other things, an attempt to control something when everything else has slipped beyond control, and it is not hard to see, in the plainest human terms, why it took hold of Diana when it did. She was 19. She had been pulled out of an ordinary life into the most watched engagement in the world. She believed, on her own account, that her future husband loved another woman. She had no power over any of it, not the wedding, not the press, not the man, not the machine. The one thing left that she could govern was her own body, and she governed it in the way that so many young women in distress have governed theirs, by starving and by purging, turning the anguish inward where no photographer could see it. The illness was the private truth of the engagement, written in the only language the machine could not immediately edit. The bare chronology of those first years shows how fast the private and the public arcs diverged. She was engaged on the 24th of February 1981, at the age of 19. Her waist fell from 29 inches to 23.5 across the 5 months that followed. She married on the 29th of July at the age of 20, before some 750 million people. Her first son, William, was born on the 21st of June 1982, less than 11 months into the marriage. Her second, Harry, followed on the 15th of September 1984. In under 4 years, she had gone from a nursery assistant in a shared flat to a wife, a princess, and the mother of 2 heirs. And through the whole of it, on her own account, she was privately unravelling. It matters, too, that she was suffering in an age and an institution with no language for what was happening to her. In the early 1980s, an eating disorder was barely spoken of in public, still less understood, and least of all, inside a royal household whose entire instinct was to suppress any hint of frailty. There was no help offered that reached the root of it, because the root of it, the marriage itself, was the one thing that could not be acknowledged. A young woman was starving herself inside the most watched marriage in the world, and the machinery around her was built not to heal the cause, but to hide the symptom. Every photograph had to show a radiant princess. Every appearance had to hold. So the illness was managed as a matter of appearances, like everything else in the marriage, kept out of sight and out of the papers, while the woman it was consuming was paraded, week after week, as the happiest and most fortunate young wife in the country. The gap between how she looked and how she felt was, quite literally, being measured on her own body, and the machine's only interest in that gap was to keep it hidden. The private reality of those first married years, on Diana's account, was despair. She spoke of feeling unwanted and unsupported, of being overwhelmed by a role that no one had prepared her for, of a loneliness that sat at the centre of the most public life in the country. She described episodes of self-harm in the early period of the marriage, the actions of a young woman in real anguish, entirely invisible behind the palace walls and the official smile. And the sheer isolation of her position deepened everything. She was surrounded at every hour by staff, by protection officers, by the apparatus of royal life, and she was, on her own testimony, more alone than she had ever been. There was no one in that household whose first loyalty was to her. The household she had married into was his, formed around him, loyal to him, years before she ever arrived. The clearest single incident from this period, and the one that shows most starkly how far the private distress ran beneath the public serenity, came in January 1982. Diana was pregnant with her first child, and by her own account, in the grip of acute unhappiness, she fell down a staircase at Sandringham. The image is almost unbearable in its contrast. Sandringham, the great royal house in Norfolk, full at that season with the assembled royal family. A pregnant princess, 6 months married, falling on the stairs in a state of despair, and a machine that closed around the incident and let nothing of its true meaning reach the public, because the public was still being shown the radiant young mother-to-be, the fairy tale entering its next happy chapter, the nation's sweetheart carrying the future of the throne. The discipline of honesty matters here as much as it does anywhere in this story. These are Diana's accounts, given through a partisan channel, at a time when she had every reason to present her own suffering as fully as she could. They are true as her testimony. They are the record of how she experienced the marriage, and that experience is real, and it is the beating heart of this film. But they are not neutral, all-seeing facts, and a fair telling holds them as what they are. One person's account of her own pain, delivered from inside a marriage that had 2 sides and 2 sufferers. What is beyond any dispute, because the number does not lie, is the waist that went from 29 inches to 23.5 in 5 months. The body kept the secret that the smile was built to hide, And the deepest cruelty of this chapter is that the suffering had to be concealed, because the concealment was, quite literally, the job. A young woman was making herself ill inside the most watched marriage in the world, and the entire machinery around her existed to ensure that not a flicker of it showed. The photographs had to be radiant. The tours had to be triumphant. The fairy tale had to hold, week after week, year after year. So the illness went underground, into the private hours and the locked bathrooms and the falling measurements, while the public was shown the exact opposite of the truth. The country believed it was watching a princess bloom. The princess was disappearing, and the two of them, the glowing public image and the vanishing private woman, were drifting further apart by the month, until at last, even the household that surrounded her could no longer hold them together, and the marriage itself began, quietly, to split in two. Chapter 7. Two households under one roof. Inside one palace apartment, a marriage quietly divided into two households that barely spoke, except through their servants. By the middle of the 1980s, the marriage had, by the broad agreement of those who chronicled it, and by the later testimony of both husband and wife, hollowed out at its centre. The two children who might have bound it were born into it. Prince William on the 21st of June 1982, and Prince Harry on the 15th of September 1984, and both parents, by every account, loved them without reservation. But between the parents themselves, the distance had opened, and it did not close. And the most extraordinary thing about that distance is the physical form it took. The marriage did not merely cool as marriages do. It divided into two separate establishments, living under one roof. At Kensington Palace in London, in the apartments numbered 8 and 9, and at Highgrove, the country house in Gloucestershire that Charles had acquired in 1980, the couple came to keep separate rooms, separate floors, separate diaries, and separate staff. They rose at different hours, kept different friends, and increasingly conducted even the practical business of a shared life through intermediaries. Messages between the Prince and Princess of Wales were carried, at times, by equerries and valets, servants moving between two wings of the same house, because the two people who lived there found it easier than speaking to each other directly. A marriage had become an arrangement of appearances maintained across a corridor, two households under one roof, joined by staff and by the requirement to appear, in public, as one. Around this divided marriage, there grew up something that the people who lived through it came to call the two camps. The private secretaries, the press officers, the equerries and the valets separated over time into a household loyal to him and a household loyal to her. Diana's private secretary, Patrick Jeffson, later wrote from the inside of that world. The two operations kept their own counsel and guarded their own principle, and by the early 1990s, they would be doing something far more damaging than merely keeping apart. But even in the middle 80s, the shape of it was set. The marriage was no longer a partnership that the household served. It was a rivalry that the household had taken sides in, a divided court arranged around a divided bed. The practical work of keeping the fiction upright fell to these people, and it was real work, skilled and unrelenting. Diaries had to be coordinated so that the couple appeared together at the right moments and were kept apart at every other. Tours had to be planned in which two people who barely spoke were choreographed into the image of a partnership, standing at the right distance, turning at the right cue, smiling on command for the world's cameras. Statements had to be managed, questions deflected, the endless curiosity of the press steered away from the truth. A whole apparatus of servants and advisors spent its days sustaining a marriage that no longer existed, because the appearance of that marriage was among the most valuable assets the crown possessed. When people speak of the machinery of the monarchy, This is what the phrase means in practice. A body of skilled professionals whose task in these years was to make a dead thing look alive for as long as the institution required it. And the household was, in the end, only doing what the institution had always done. The British monarchy had for centuries prized the appearance of its marriages over their reality, arranging unions for succession and alliance, and presenting them to the public as models of virtue, whatever went on behind the doors. What made the Wales marriage different was not the gap between image and truth, which was old, but the scale of the audience and the ferocity of the press, which were new. In an earlier age, a divided royal marriage could be hidden almost completely, known only to the court. In the 1980s, it had to be hidden from 750 million people and a press that hunted every crack, and so the machinery of concealment had to grow to match, more elaborate, more disciplined, more total than anything the institution had needed before. The two camps at Kensington Palace were the old royal habit of managed appearances, scaled up to meet the pressures of the modern world, and strained, already, to the very edge of what they could bear. And here is the truth this whole film is built to name, the sentence to hold on to through everything that follows. The performance mattered more than the people. The institution did not require that Charles and Diana be happy, or even that they be civil to one another in private. It required that they appear on the balcony and on the tour and at the family gathering to be a marriage. The appearance was the product. The reality was a private matter to be managed, contained, and above all, hidden from view. So the household organized itself, with real skill and real discipline, around the maintenance of an image that had come loose from the truth. Two people who could barely be in a room together were choreographed into the picture of a couple, over and over for years, because the picture was what the Crown had sold, and the Crown could not be seen to have sold a lie. The settings themselves tell the story better than any narration could. Kensington Palace, apartments 8 and 9, became the clearest physical emblem of the whole theme. A single grand residence run, over time, as two households under one roof, and it would become Diana's own base after the separation. Highgrove became, increasingly, his domain, the garden he built and retreated into, the world where he was comfortable and she was not, so that she spent less and less time there. Balmoral and Sandringham became the stages on which the wider family gathered, and the couple were required to perform togetherness for the assembled relations and the waiting press, the church walks, the holiday photographs, the set pieces of a united royal family. Each house had its part in the production. None of them held a marriage any longer, only the appearance of one, arranged for whoever happened to be watching. The strangeness of this becomes clearer the wider you pull the frame. In these very years, the Prince and Princess of Wales were among the most famous people alive on the planet. They toured the world. They were photographed many thousands of times. They drew crowds in the hundreds of thousands. They appeared, jointly and radiantly, on magazine covers in every language on earth. And behind every one of those images was the divided apartment, the separate diaries, the messages carried by servants, the two camps guarding their two principals. The distance between the image and the reality was not a small thing that grew. It was, by the mid-1980s, the defining fact of the marriage, an entire fiction sustained by an entire household, so that a public which adored the Prince and Princess of Wales had almost no idea that the Prince and Princess of Wales had, in every way that counted, already stopped being married. That is the quiet horror at the heart of these middle years, and it is worth naming plainly before the story moves on. The failure of the marriage was not the scandal. Marriages fail. The scandal was the machinery, the deliberate, disciplined, years-long effort by an institution and its servants to keep a dead marriage standing in public, because the living truth was inconvenient. A young woman was being made to perform a happiness she did not feel, beside a man she could barely speak to, in front of the largest audience in the world, and the whole apparatus of the palace was bent to making that performance convincing. And both of the performers by now had turned for comfort to someone outside the marriage, so that the picture the household worked so hard to maintain was on both sides a lie. The two principals were themselves living around every single day. Chapter 8. The constant on each side. By the middle of the decade, both of them had found, elsewhere, the thing the marriage had promised and never gave. The story of what happened inside the marriage of Charles and Diana is, at its heart, a story of two people who each looked outside it for the intimacy it withheld. And the symmetry of that is important, because it is easy and wrong to tell this as the tale of one guilty party and one wronged one. Both spouses, on their own later accounts, sought elsewhere the closeness the marriage did not give them. The household absorbed both. And the parallel between the two relationships is not an accident of the telling. It is the shape of the marriage itself, a shape with a betrayal on each side of it. The symmetry is even closer than it first appears, and it is worth setting the details side by side. Camilla was born in 1947, 14 years before Diana, and she had married Andrew Parker Bowles, an officer in the Household Cavalry, on the 4th of July 1973, 8 years before Charles married Diana. James Hewitt, the man to whom Diana turned from about 1986, was also an officer in the Household Cavalry, and he had entered her life in the most innocent way imaginable, as the instructor who taught her to ride and to master a fear of horses. Two Household Cavalry officers then, one on each side of the marriage, each the constant that the marriage itself was not. The pattern is almost too neat, and it says something true about how these things happen, that people find warmth in the worlds they already move through, among the familiar faces of their own circle, rather than in grand romantic accident. What the symmetry should guard against is the simple story the tabloids preferred, of a wronged wife and a guilty husband, or in the crueler version, of a straying wife who deserved what she got. Neither is the truth, and the truth is sadder and more ordinary than either. Two people had been placed together by an institution that cared more for the match than for the marriage, and they had discovered, quickly, that they could not give each other what a marriage is meant to give. One of them, on his own account, had loved another woman all along. The other, a girl of 19, had walked in hoping for a love story and found a cold house and a husband already spoken for. That both of them, in time, looked elsewhere is not a moral puzzle. It is the entirely human consequence of two people being bound together for reasons that had nothing to do with whether they could make each other happy. The betrayal on each side was real, but the deeper betrayal was the one the institution had committed first, in joining them at all. On his side, there was Camilla. She had been there, in one form or another, from before the beginning. Born in 1947, married since the 4th of July 1973 to the Household Cavalry officer Andrew Parker Bowles, she had been close to Charles since the early 1970s, years before Diana was ever considered. In this film, she is not the villain of a melodrama, and it is important not to reduce her to one, because she is now the queen, and because the caricature would be both unfair and untrue. She is, rather, the reason the reconciliation Diana longed for was never actually available. The attachment that predated the marriage also outlasted every attempt to end it. Whatever Diana hoped for in the early years, some turning towards her, some closing of the distance, the space in her husband's life that she needed was already occupied, and had been since before she met him. There is a particular cruelty in that timing, and it belongs to Diana's whole position. She had not walked into a marriage that later went wrong. She had, on her own account, walked into a marriage that was already, in its emotional centre, spoken for. The bracelet she said she found before the wedding was, in her telling, the proof of it. And so the ordinary hope of a young wife that with time and children and patience the marriage might grow into the thing she wanted was, in her case, hope against a fact that had been fixed before she arrived. She was not competing for a husband who had drifted. She was competing, from the very start, with a bond older than her own marriage, and it was a competition the institution had no interest in helping her to win. On Diana's side, from about 1986, there was James Hewitt. He was, like Andrew Parker Bowles, an officer in the household cavalry, and he had come into Diana's life as a riding instructor, teaching her to overcome a fear of horses. The relationship between them ran for roughly 5 years, until about 1991. Diana would later speak of it in her own words, and the words are worth holding for the account they give of the marriage as a whole. "Yes," she said of Hewitt, "I adored him. Yes," she added, "I was in love with him." And she said, too, that she had been let down. Hewitt's own later conduct, cooperating with a book and selling private letters, would earn him the contempt of the press and the lasting label of a man who had betrayed her. But that came afterwards. In the years themselves, he was, on her side, what Camilla was on his, the constant the marriage had failed to be. Laying the two relationships side by side is not a way of keeping a moral scoreboard. It is a way of seeing the marriage plainly for what it had become. Here were two people, joined before 750 million witnesses, who had each, within a few years, found the intimacy they needed in someone other than the person they had married. That is not a story of a good spouse and a bad one. It is a story of a marriage that did not work, that could not give either person inside it what a marriage is supposed to give, and of two human beings who did what unhappy people have always done, and looked for warmth wherever they could find it. The household, with its two camps and its separate wings, quietly made room for both and kept the secret of both, and went on presenting the couple to the world as one. Through all of it, the public performance continued without a pause, and that is the fact that never stops being extraordinary. While Charles maintained the relationship with Camilla and Diana turned to Hewitt, the Prince and Princess of Wales went on appearing jointly and smilingly as the model royal marriage. They stood together on balconies. They toured together. They attended together the weddings and the funerals and the state occasions where a united family was required. The machinery of appearances did not merely survive the collapse of the marriage. It worked hardest precisely when the marriage was most hollow, because the hollower the reality, the more work the image required. The performance mattered more than the people, and never more than now, when the people had each, in private, quietly given up. In all of this, there was a slow gathering of danger that none of them could yet see. Two intimate relationships conducted alongside a public marriage, in an age when private telephone calls could be plucked out of the air by strangers, and private confidences could be carried out of a palace and sold, were never going to stay private forever. The material of a scandal was accumulating, quietly, on both sides at once. Letters were being written, telephone calls were being made, confidences were being shared with people who would not always keep them. The marriage had become a fiction sustained by a household, and beneath the fiction lay a great mass of private truth that needed only a crack to come pouring out. The crack was coming. And when it came, it would not come from a courtier or a servant. It would come out of the air itself, from two telephone calls that two strangers happened to be listening to. On nights the speakers believed themselves entirely alone. Chapter 9. the wife who outshone the heir. The crowds came for her, not for him, and the gap between the radiant image and the cold reality only grew wider. There is a bitter irony sitting at the centre of the marriage's public years, and it is this. The very fame that made the fairy tale so valuable to the institution also drove a wedge deeper into the marriage the institution was straining to protect. Because Diana, the shy 19-year-old chosen for her softness and her lack of a world of her own, turned out to be the most magnetic public figure the royal family had produced in living memory. She did more than play the part of a princess. She eclipsed everyone around her, including the man she had married, and the eclipse itself became a wound that never healed. The turning point that everyone remembers is the tour of Australia and New Zealand in the spring of 1983. It was the first great overseas tour of the marriage, and the couple did something that broke sharply with royal habit. They took the infant Prince William with them, rather than leave him behind for months, as custom demanded. That decision was Diana's instinct, and it set the tone for the kind of mother she would be, present, hands-on, unwilling to be parted from her child by the machinery of duty. But it was what happened in the crowds that changed everything. The people came out in numbers that astonished even the organisers, and they came, unmistakably, for her. On the walkabouts, it was Diana the crowds strained towards, Diana they had queued to see, and the difference was impossible to hide. The heir to the throne found himself, on his own tour, the lesser attraction, standing a few feet from a wife the whole world had fallen in love with. The effect of that on the man it was happening to can hardly be overstated, and it makes no sense without his whole life behind it. Charles had been raised, from the age of 3, as the centre of the national story. He was the heir, the future king, the point around which the institution arranged itself. He had chosen, or been guided towards, a young and unformed bride, in part because such a bride would fit quietly into the world that revolved around him. Instead, he had married a phenomenon. The crowds, the magazine covers, the adoration, all of it flowed towards Diana, and a man who had spent his entire existence at the centre of attention found himself, in his own marriage, moved to the edge of the frame. Those close to the couple describe the resentment that this bred, the sense of an heir overshadowed and diminished by the fame of his own wife, and that resentment poured back into a marriage that was already cold and chilled it further still. The scale of Diana's fame in these years is difficult to convey to anyone who did not live through it. She became the most photographed woman in the world. Her clothes launched industries. Her hairstyle was copied on every high street in the country. A single appearance could dominate the front pages of newspapers across several continents at once. She drew crowds in the hundreds of thousands, sold magazines in the millions, and commanded a share of the world's attention that no member of the royal family had held before, and, it can fairly be said, none has held since. And every ounce of that attention was, from the institution's point of view, both an asset and a problem, because it was attention that could not be controlled, and it was flowing towards the one person in the marriage least equipped and least inclined to be told what to do with it. The 1983 tour of Australia and New Zealand shows the machine of her fame at full power. The couple took the infant Prince William, then not yet 1 year old, across the world with them, breaking with a royal custom that had left small children behind for months. The crowds that came out numbered in the hundreds of thousands. The newspapers that covered the tour sold in their millions, and at the centre of it stood a woman of 21, married barely 18 months, drawing to herself a scale of public devotion that no member of the royal family had commanded in living memory. She had been a nursery assistant 3 years before. Now she was the most famous woman on the planet, and the planet could not get enough of her. The problem this created for the institution was subtle but profound. and it would shape everything that followed. The modern monarchy lives on public affection, and here was a member of the family generating more public affection than the crown had seen in generations. That should have been the purest possible asset. But the affection was not for the institution. It was for Diana, personally, and it could not be transferred, or shared, or controlled. A young woman who had entered the family as its most pliable member had become, without meaning to, its most powerful one, holding directly in her own hands the very thing the whole institution existed to cultivate, the love of the people. An institution built on hierarchy and control now contained, at its centre, a person whose power came from outside the hierarchy entirely and answered to no one within it. The palace did not yet know how dangerous that was. It would learn when the same woman decided to tell her own story, and the public believed her over the throne. For Diana herself, the fame was a complicated inheritance, and it changed her. It gave her, for the first time in her life, a form of power. The girl who had no fortune and no profession and no defences discovered that she possessed something the institution wanted and could not manufacture, which was the genuine love of the public. In time she would learn to wield it, to stage an image, to speak past the palace directly to the millions who adored her. But in these middle years, the fame mostly deepened her isolation inside the marriage. It made her husband resentful. It made the courtiers wary of her. It made her, in one of the strangest paradoxes of the whole story, more alone at the very moment she was more adored than any woman on earth. Because the adoration was for the image, and the image was not the woman, and the woman was still behind the palace doors, leading half a life across a corridor from a husband who had turned elsewhere. And the fame did one more thing, which mattered enormously for what was to come. It guaranteed that when the marriage finally cracked, it would crack in the loudest possible way. A private couple can separate quietly, and the world need never know. A couple watched by the entire world, sold to that world as a fairy tale, and headed by the most famous woman alive, cannot separate quietly at all. Every strain in this marriage was a strain under the hottest lights on the planet. Every private truth, once it escaped, would escape onto the front pages of the world in a single morning. The fame that had made the fairy tale so valuable had also loaded the eventual collapse with a force that no palace machine, however skilled and however disciplined, was ever going to be able to contain. So the middle of the marriage held a contradiction that could not last. The institution needed Diana's fame, because it was the most powerful asset the monarchy had possessed in generations, and the institution feared Diana's fame, because it belonged to her, and not to them, and it could not be governed. It flowed towards a woman who was miserable inside a marriage the palace was straining to preserve, and it turned that woman, slowly, into the one person in the country with the power to tell her own story to a public that would believe her over the palace every time. The machine had made a fairy tale of a marriage, and the fairy tale had made a superstar of the bride, and the superstar was about to become the single greatest threat the fiction had ever faced. And the first pieces of the collapse were already sitting on magnetic tape, recorded on 2 December nights, waiting for the world to hear them. Chapter 10. Voices stolen from the air. 2 private telephone calls, caught by strangers with radio scanners, would strip both of them bare years after they were spoken. In the closing days of the 1980s, the private lives of the Prince and Princess of Wales collided with a piece of ordinary technology that nobody in the palace had reckoned with. Mobile telephones of that era broadcast their calls, in effect, over the open air, and an amateur with a radio scanner and enough patience could pluck a private conversation out of the sky and record it onto a cassette. 2 such conversations were captured, both in December 1989, and between them, They would do more to demolish the public fiction of the marriage than any book or any interview, because they let the whole country listen, in the speaker's own voices, to the truth the palace had spent a decade hiding. The first was a call between Diana and a close friend named James Gilby. It was recorded on the 31st of December 1989, and in it, Gilby addressed the Princess of Wales by an affectionate nickname, calling her Squidgy, so that when the tape surfaced, it entered the language as Squidgygate. The recording did not reach the public at once. It sat, as such things did, until it was published, and it broke into the newspapers on the 23rd of August, 1992. When it did, the country heard the most famous woman in the world speaking privately, intimately, unguardedly to a man who was not her husband. The fairy tale did not survive the sound of her real voice, and it did not have to be interpreted or explained because the public could simply hear it, in her own words, on a tape. The second call was, if anything, more damaging still, and it belonged to the other side of the marriage. It was a conversation between Charles and Camilla, recorded on the 18th of December 1989, and it became known as Camillagate. It surfaced later than the first, breaking into print in January 1993, first in Australia and then in the British press. The contents were intimate in a way that was acutely embarrassing for the heir to the throne, and the tape did to Charles precisely what Squidgygate had done to Diana. It replaced the official image with the private voice. It let the public hear, unmediated and unmanaged, the reality that the machinery of appearances had been built to conceal. And it confirmed, in the plainest possible way, that the third person Diana had believed in since before the wedding was entirely real, and had been there all along. The sheer randomness of how it happened tells you how completely the old rules had broken down. These were not documents stolen by a spy or leaked by a disloyal servant. They were private conversations, spoken into telephones on ordinary December evenings, that happened to be floating through the open air as radio signals, and that happened to be caught by amateurs sitting at home with scanners who happened to recognize the voices and happened to press record. The most intimate secrets of the heir to the throne and his wife were exposed not by any grand conspiracy, but by chance and cheap technology, by hobbyists with receivers picking words out of the sky. There was no defending against it, because there was no attacker to defend against. There was only the new, indifferent openness of the modern airwaves, into which the royal family had wandered without the faintest idea of the danger. The deeper reason the tapes were so devastating is that they destroyed the last remnant of an older bargain between the Crown and the press. For most of the 20th century, the British newspapers had extended to the royal family a broad deference, printing the warm and the reassuring and looking away from the rest, treating the private lives of royalty as, on the whole, out of bounds. That deference had been the palace's shield, and it was the reason the divided marriage could be hidden at all. By the early 1990s, the deference was gone. A newer, hungrier, more competitive press had decided that the private lives of the royal family were the greatest story it possessed, and it pursued that story with a ferocity the old rules had never permitted. The tapes were both a symptom of that change and an accelerant of it. Once the private voices of the prince and princess had been printed on the front pages, there was no line the press would not now cross, and no privacy the palace could any longer promise to protect. The world, in which a royal marriage could be quietly managed, had ended, and the Wales marriage was the thing that ended it, torn open on the airwaves for anyone with a scanner and a cassette to hear. The importance of the two tapes is not really about their contents, embarrassing as those were. It is about what they represented and about what they broke. For a decade, the marriage had been a fiction maintained by a disciplined household, a matter of controlled images and managed appearances, of what the public was permitted to see, and what it was not. The tapes shattered that control at a single stroke, because they had come from outside the machine entirely. No courtier had leaked them, no servant had sold them. They had been stolen out of the air by strangers, and once they existed, there was nothing the palace could do to unhear them. The private truth of the marriage, both sides of it at once, was now public property, and it had become public property by a route the institution had no way to police. There is a wider historical meaning here that the story cannot ignore. The marriage of Charles and Diana was the first great royal marriage to collide with the modern age of surveillance and mass media, and it was comprehensively unready for it. The monarchy's entire method of managing its image had been built for an older world, a world of deferential newspapers and controllable photographs, and a press that, on the whole, printed what it was handed. That world was ending. Scanners, tabloids, and a public appetite that no palace could satisfy were turning royal privacy into a commodity to be bought and sold, and the Wales marriage was the first to be consumed by it. The same forces that pulled 2 private phone calls out of the sky were the forces that would, in the end, pursue Diana through the streets of Paris. The tapes were an early warning of a machinery the palace could not control, and the warning was not heeded, because the palace did not yet grasp that the rules of the whole game had changed. For the 2 people at the centre of it, the tapes were a humiliation almost beyond imagining. Everything they had said in the belief that they were alone, everything murmured down a telephone line on a December night, was now being read aloud on breakfast tables across the world. The performance that the household had maintained for a decade was being contradicted, word for word, in the speakers' own voices, by recordings no press office could suppress. And there was no defense against it, because the words were real, and the public could hear that they were real, and no official denial could compete with the sound of the principals themselves. The worst of it, from the palace's point of view, was that the tapes were only the beginning. They were the first breach in a wall that had held for 10 years, and once the wall was breached, the pressure behind it began to force its way through everywhere at once. Because at the very same time as the recordings were surfacing, the Princess of Wales herself was doing something the institution had never anticipated and could not have prevented. She was secretly assembling her own account of the marriage, in her own words, on her own terms, and she was about to hand it to the world in the most deliberate form of all, not a stolen tape, but a book she had helped to write. Chapter 11. The Book That Broke the Silence. While the palace still insisted the marriage was intact, the wife was secretly dismantling the fiction from within. On the 16th of June 1992, a book appeared that changed everything. It was written by the journalist Andrew Morton, and it was called Diana, Her True Story. On its face, it was an unauthorized biography, the sort of thing the palace could dismiss and had dismissed many times before. But this book was different in a way that would only be fully understood after Diana's death. And the difference is the single most audacious act in the whole story of the marriage. The book was built on tapes that Diana had recorded herself, answering questions in her own voice, and had passed secretly to Morton through an intermediary. The princess had testified against her own marriage from inside it, while the palace still officially maintained that the marriage was sound. The mechanism by which she did it is almost novelistic in its detail. Diana could not simply meet a journalist, not in her position, watched as she was at every hour of the day. So the questions and the answers travelled by a go-between, a friend named Dr. James Colthurst, who carried the cassette tapes back and forth across London by bicycle, ferrying the private testimony of the most famous woman in the world between her and the writer who would publish it. On those tapes, Diana laid out, in her own words, the separate lives, the despair, the eating disorder, and above all, the presence of the third person in the marriage. The book put onto the public record, from Diana's side, everything the household had been built to hide. And it did so while the machinery of appearances was still turning, while the official position remained that the Prince and Princess of Wales were a functioning royal couple with an ordinary set of difficulties. The courage and the desperation the act required, in equal measure, are worth holding in the mind. Here was a woman so trapped inside an institution, so watched, so unable to speak in her own name, that the only way she could tell the truth about her own life was to record it in secret and smuggle it out by bicycle to be published under someone else's name. It was the act of a woman who had, at last, learned how to use the one weapon she truly possessed, which was her own voice and the public's hunger to hear it, against the institution that had silenced her. She could not stand up and speak. So she found a way to speak that the palace could not stop. And by the time anyone understood what she had done, the book was in the shops, and the truth was in the open, and there was no putting it back. The secrecy of the operation was not a flourish. It was a necessity, and it measures exactly how trapped she was. A Princess of Wales could not hold a press conference. She could not give an interview in her own name, while the palace maintained that her marriage was sound. Every word she spoke in public was watched, weighed, and, where possible, controlled by the household around her. The only route left to her was the covert one, the tapes recorded in private and carried across London by a friend on a bicycle, the truth smuggled out of the palace like contraband because there was no lawful door through which it could walk. That a woman at the very summit of the country, adored by millions, should have to resort to such a method to tell the truth about her own life is one of the sharpest illustrations the story offers of what the institution had made of her. She was the most famous woman in the world, and she was at the same time so thoroughly silenced that she had to smuggle out her own voice. Once the book was out, the character of the whole conflict changed, and it grew uglier by the week. The two households no longer merely guarded their principles. They went to war for them in the pages of the newspapers, each side feeding the press its own version of events and its own case against the other. Every leak was answered by a counter-leak, every story by a rival story, until the collapse of the marriage had become a running public battle fought by proxy through the tabloids. The press, which had once deferentially looked away, now had both camps competing to feed it, and it gorged. The dignity that the institution prized above almost everything was being shredded daily, not by outsiders, but by the rival servants of the two principals themselves. And the country watched the most famous marriage in the world being pulled apart in public by the very people whose job had once been to hold it together. With Diana's account now in the open, and the tapes surfacing alongside it, the collapse of the marriage entered a new and uglier phase. The phase the press itself named the War of the Waleses. The two camps that had formed within the household years earlier now did openly what they had been doing quietly for years. They briefed against each other. The private secretaries and the press advisors loyal to each side fed the newspapers, each seeking to shape the story in favour of their own principle and against the other. The marriage's collapse became a public contest of narratives, managed by rival staffs, fought through leaks and counter-leaks in the press. A dead marriage was being administered as it failed, turned into a campaign, with each side using the machinery of publicity as a weapon against the other, in full view of a fascinated country. The scale of the coverage in this period is hard to convey to anyone who did not see it. The marriage of Charles and Diana was, for months on end, the biggest running story in the British press, and one of the biggest in the world. Morton's book became an international bestseller many times over. The two tapes were transcribed and pored over on front pages across continents. Every appearance by either principal was scrutinized for signs of the war beneath it, every glance and every gesture read for meaning. The couple, who had been sold to some 750 million people as a fairy tale 11 years before, were now being consumed by an audience just as vast, as a spectacle of an entirely different kind. The slow, public dismemberment of the very marriage the whole world had been invited to celebrate. And there was a deeper significance in what Diana had done with the Morton book, beyond the damage it did in the moment. She had discovered, and then proved, that the balance of power between a royal individual and the royal institution had shifted and shifted towards her. For centuries, the palace had controlled the story, because the palace controlled access and information and the deferential press that depended on both. Diana had gone around all of it. She had spoken directly to the public, over the heads of the courtiers, and the public had believed her. It was a lesson she would not forget, and it was one the institution could not unlearn either. The wife they had chosen for her pliability had turned out to hold a weapon the throne itself could not match, the love of the people, and she had just shown that she was willing to use it. Yet even now, with all of this in the open, the official machinery kept turning. The couple were still required to appear together at the occasions that demanded it. The public performance of the marriage, incredibly, continued even as its private truth was being read aloud in every newspaper in the land, because the institution still could not bring itself to formally admit what everyone in the country now plainly knew. That admission, when it finally came, would require the couple to break on camera, in front of the world, so completely that even the palace could no longer pretend. And that breaking was about to happen, first in a single, silent photograph in front of a monument to love, and then on a frozen tour that the press would name with one cruel little word. Chapter 12. The marriage breaks on camera. She sat alone before a monument to love, and the photograph told the world what the palace would not. By 1992, the marriage was over in every way except the official one, and in that year it began to break in public, on camera, in images that no press office could spin away. The first and most famous of them was taken on the 11th of February 1992 during a tour of India. Diana went to the Taj Mahal, the great white monument that an emperor built as a tomb for the wife he loved, one of the most romantic buildings on earth. And she was photographed there entirely alone, seated by herself on the bench before it, a solitary figure in front of a shrine to married love while her husband was elsewhere. The photograph needed no caption. It was understood instantly, around the world, as a statement about a marriage in which she was alone. There was a further, quieter cruelty folded into the choice of place, because Charles had visited the Taj Mahal as a young bachelor in 1980 and was reported to have said that he would one day bring his own bride to see it. Now the bride sat there alone, and the country read the picture in a single glance. The image was, in part, Diana's own doing, and that is what makes it so important to understand her. She had learned by now exactly how to speak to the public without saying a word. She knew what a photograph of the Princess of Wales, alone before the Taj Mahal, would mean to the millions who would see it, and she allowed it to be taken. The girl who had once looked at the pavement and blushed had become a woman who could compose a message to the entire world out of a single seated figure and a famous building. It was the same weapon she had used with the Morton book, the public's hunger for her image turned back against the institution that had trapped her, and here she used it with a precision that the palace, for all its machinery, could not begin to match. If the Taj Mahal photograph was a message she chose to send, the tour of South Korea in November 1992 was the marriage breaking without anyone choosing it at all. The couple travelled together, as duty required, and they were so visibly miserable, so unable even to perform the ordinary courtesies of a couple in public, that the press coined a single word for the tour that has clung to it ever since. They called it the Glums. Photograph after photograph showed two people locked in a shared unhappiness they could no longer hide, turned away from one another, faces set and cold, the performance failing in real time in front of the cameras. It was their last joint overseas tour, and it looked, to everyone who saw it, exactly like what it was. An ending being lived out in public because duty would not yet permit it to be announced. The single year of 1992 carried almost the whole collapse within it, blow after blow. In February came the solo photograph at the Taj Mahal. In June came Andrew Morton's book, laying out Diana's account in her own smuggled words. In August, the Squidgygate tape broke into the newspapers, more than 2 years after the call had been recorded. In November came the frozen misery of the South Korea tour, the Glums. And in December, the Prime Minister rose in the Commons to announce the separation. 5 hammer blows in 11 months, each one stripping away another layer of the fiction, until by the year's end, nothing of the official story was left standing. The marriage that had taken a summer's day in 1981 to celebrate took a single year, 11 years later, to come apart in full view of the world. There is a grim significance in the fact that it fell to the Prime Minister to announce it. A marriage is, for almost everyone who ever enters one, a private matter, made, and, if it must be, unmade between two people and those closest to them. This one had become a matter of state, its ending read into the official record of Parliament by the head of the government of the United Kingdom. That single fact captures how completely these two people belonged, by now, not to themselves, but to the institution and the country. They could not marry privately, and they could not part privately either. The beginning had been staged before 750 million people, and the ending was declared from the floor of the House of Commons, and in between lay 11 years in which almost nothing that happened to them had been truly their own. Even the announcement of their separation was an act of the machine, performed for the country, phrased to protect the crown, delivered by a politician at a dispatch box. Nothing about this marriage, from its first day to its formal last, had ever been allowed simply to belong to the man and the woman inside it. And so, at last, the institution did the thing it had spent a decade avoiding. On the 9th of December 1992, the Prime Minister, John Major, rose in the House of Commons and read out a formal statement. The Prince and Princess of Wales, he announced, were to separate. He told the House that the separation was amicable. He insisted, to the visible disbelief of many who heard it, that there was no constitutional implication, and that Diana could in theory still one day be crowned queen. It was the machinery making its last, doomed attempt to control a story that had long since escaped it. A Prime Minister at the dispatch box of the House of Commons trying to describe the collapse of the most famous marriage in the world as a tidy administrative arrangement with no larger meaning at all. The scale of that moment deserves to be marked, because there is nothing else quite like it. A marriage that had been sold to some 750 million people, celebrated at St. Paul's before 3,500 guests, headed for 11 years by the most photographed woman alive, was now being formally dissolved from the floor of Parliament, announced by the head of government of the United Kingdom, treated as a matter of state. The fiction that a household had maintained across 2 royal residences for a decade had finally grown too heavy to hold, and it had taken the Prime Minister himself, standing in the Commons, to set it down. And even in the setting down, the machinery could not quite tell the whole truth, insisting on the word amicable and the fiction of no consequence. performing composure over a wreck that the entire country could see. The strangest part of that statement, looking back, is the sheer effort it made to deny what it was announcing. A separation was being declared, and in the same breath, the country was being assured that nothing had really changed, that the Constitution was untouched, that the future was as before, that Diana might still be queen. It was the reflex of an institution that had spent a decade insisting the marriage was fine, unable, even at the moment of formal collapse, to stop insisting. The performance did not end when the marriage was declared over. The performance simply changed its subject from a marriage that was well to a separation that was harmless, and the country was asked, once again, to look at the surface and not the wreck beneath it. But a separation is not a divorce, and the announcement of December 1992 settled nothing, least of all the question of the narrative. Both principals now understood that the story of the marriage would be told and fought over in public, and that whoever told it best would win the sympathy of the country. So each of them, in turn, would go to the one medium powerful enough to reach the whole nation at once. Each would sit down in front of a television camera and give an account of the marriage, and each account would be a weapon aimed squarely at the other. The war that had been fought through leaks and books was about to be fought in confessions, broadcast to millions, in the words of the husband and the wife themselves. Chapter 13. 2 confessions, 2 cameras. Each of them turned to a television camera to tell their side, and each confession was a bid to control the story. The husband went first. On the 29th of June 1994, a television documentary made with the writer Jonathan Dimbleby was broadcast, and in it, Charles did something no heir to the throne had done before. He admitted adultery. But the exact form of the admission matters enormously, and it must be quoted with the qualifier that Charles himself attached to it, because without that qualifier, the words misrepresent the man who spoke them. He said that he had been faithful and honourable in his marriage, until, in his own words, it had become irretrievably broken down. That is the admission. Not that he had betrayed his marriage from the start, but that he had returned to the other relationship only once the marriage was, in his account, already dead. It was a confession carefully framed to protect him even as it conceded the central fact, and the country heard it as the first open acknowledgement from either principal of what everyone had long known. The wife's answer came a year and a half later, and it was far more devastating. On the 20th of November 1995, the BBC broadcast an interview with Diana on its programme Panorama, conducted by a journalist named Martin Bashir. It was watched in the United Kingdom by an audience of around 23 million people, an enormous share of the entire country, gathered to hear the Princess of Wales speak, at last, in her own name and on her own terms. And she was extraordinary. She was composed, wounded, and precise. She admitted the relationship with James Hewitt, saying she had adored him and been let down. She questioned, gently and devastatingly, whether her husband was suited to the role of king. She said she would like to be a queen of people's hearts, and she delivered the single sentence that would outlive everyone in the story. There were 3 of us in this marriage, she said, so it was a bit crowded. That sentence is the whole of this film compressed into 11 words. It was the third person, named at last, by the woman who had believed in that third person since before the wedding, since the parcel in the aid's office and the bracelet engraved with 2 letters. Everything the household had spent a decade concealing was now stated, calmly, by the Princess of Wales herself, to 23 million of her own countrymen, and a watching world beyond them. It was the covert testimony of the Morton book, made public in her own face and her own voice, and it destroyed, finally and completely, the last surviving remnant of the official fiction. The performance that had begun on a cathedral balcony in 1981 ended, in effect, on a television screen in 1995, with the leading lady stepping out of the part to tell the audience the truth. That both of them chose television is itself a mark of how far the world had turned. There had been a time when the private troubles of the royal family were settled, if at all, in private, behind palace doors, mediated by courtiers and shielded from the public entirely. Now the heir to the throne and his wife each went, in turn, to the most public medium ever invented, and laid their cases before the nation directly, as if the country were a jury they were each trying to win. Charles gave his account to a documentary watched by millions. Diana gave hers to an audience of some 23 million in a single evening. The marriage that had been sold to the public as a spectacle was now being contested before that same public as a spectacle, each spouse appealing over the heads of the palace to the people themselves. It was the logic of Diana's whole late strategy, the public as the final court, extended now to both sides, and it left the institution as a bystander at the destruction of its own most valuable image, unable to control either confession, watching its heir and his wife try their marriage in the court of public opinion on live television. And the public, on the whole, found for Diana. That was the outcome the palace had most to fear, and it was the outcome the two broadcasts produced. Charles's admission, however carefully qualified, was the confession of the future king to adultery, and it damaged him. Diana's interview, for all that would later be learned about how it was obtained, was the performance of a wronged and dignified woman speaking her truth, and it moved the country. The sympathy of the nation, which the institution had spent centuries cultivating, and which Diana had learned to command better than the throne itself, settled decisively on her side. The machine had lost control of its own story to the very woman it had chosen for her pliability, and it had lost it in front of the largest audiences television could gather. But here, the story must carry a caveat that is not optional, because the interview that did so much damage was itself obtained by a deception, and to cite what Diana said without saying how the interview was got would be to repeat a wrong. In May 2021, an independent inquiry led by Lord Dyson found that Martin Bashir had used faked bank statements to deceive Diana's brother, Earl Spencer, and so to win the introduction that led to the interview. The inquiry found that Bashir had acted deceitfully and that the BBC had fallen short of the standards of integrity and transparency that should have governed it. The BBC apologised, returned the awards the programme had won, and said the interview would never be broadcast again. What Diana said in that interview remains a matter of record, and it was true to her own account of her marriage. But the manner in which her words were obtained was found, a quarter of a century later, to have been dishonest, and the honest telling of this story carries that finding wherever the interview is named. There is a bitter symmetry in that, and it belongs to the deepest theme of the whole story. The most famous account Diana ever gave of her own suffering, the interview in which she finally spoke for herself to the entire nation, was itself the product of a manipulation, a piece of deceit worked upon her family to get her in front of the camera. Even her truest moment of truth was, it turned out, engineered by someone else for his own ends. The woman who had spent 15 years inside a fiction, managed by others, gave her greatest testimony against that fiction inside another one, arranged by a journalist who lied to reach her. The layers of performance and deception around this woman went down further than even she knew. The two confessions, taken together, finished the marriage in the eyes of the world, and they left the institution with no way back. Days after the Panorama interview, in December 1995, the Queen did what the collapse had made unavoidable. She wrote to both her son and her daughter-in-law, urging them to divorce and to do it quickly, as the only way to end the damage to the family and to the crown. The institution that had staged the marriage, sustained the fiction, and clung to the appearance for a decade and a half, was now, in the sovereign's own hand, instructing the couple to bring it formally to an end. The performance was over at last. What remained was the settling of accounts, and one small cutting detail about a set of initials that Diana was about to lose. Chapter 14. The Divorce and the Lost Initials. When the marriage was finally dissolved, she kept her title and her rooms, but lost 3 letters that had meant everything. The divorce moved with the efficiency of an institution that had at last decided what it wanted. A decree nisi was granted in July 1996, and the decree absolute, the final dissolution of the marriage, followed on the 28th of August 1996. 15 years and 1 month after the wedding at St. Paul's, the most famous marriage in the world was legally ended. And the terms of that ending told their own quiet story about what the institution valued and what it was prepared to take away. Diana kept a great deal. She kept the title Diana, Princess of Wales. She kept her apartments at Kensington Palace, the London home that had once been the divided marital residence and was now simply hers. She kept a central role in the upbringing of her 2 sons, the future king among them. On the financial side, the settlement was confidential, its true terms never officially disclosed, and the figures that circulated came from the press rather than from any statement. It was widely reported that she received a lump sum of around £17 million, together with roughly £400,000 a year to run her private office, and those numbers must be held as press estimates rather than confirmed facts, because the actual terms were never made public. What is certain is that she left the marriage with her home, her children, her title, and her fame intact. The bare figures of the settlement, held always as the press estimates they are, give a sense of the scale of the unwinding. The decree nisi came in July 1996, the decree absolute on the 28th of August, 15 years and 1 month after the wedding of the 29th of July 1981. She was reported to have received a lump sum of around £17 million and roughly £400,000 a year to run her private office. She kept apartments 8 and 9 at Kensington Palace, the London home that had been the divided marital residence. She kept a full role in raising her 2 sons. Every one of those numbers, save the dates, is a press estimate rather than a confirmed term, because the settlement was sealed and never officially disclosed, and the story is careful to say so. The removal of the style. Her Royal Highness deserves to be understood for what it truly was, because it was not a mere technicality. Rank in the royal family is not decoration. It is a precise system of precedence that governs who bows to whom, who enters a room first, where a person stands in the fixed order of the court. To strip Diana of the style Her Royal Highness was to move her, formally and permanently, down that order, so that the mother of the future king would rank below figures far junior to her, and would, in the strict theory of precedence, owe them the courtesies of an inferior. It was the institution using its own most intimate language, the grammar of rank, to make a statement about where Diana now stood in relation to the family she had married into. She had been the most famous woman in the world and the mother of a king to come, and the machine reached into its oldest system of hierarchy to remind her and everyone else that she was now outside the circle. Whether it was meant as cruelty or merely as procedure, it was felt as cruelty, and it was the last thing the marriage did to her before it let her go. But there was one thing the institution took from her, and it was the thing that cut deepest, because it was not about money at all. Diana lost the style, Her Royal Highness. 3 letters, the H, the R, and the H, the mark of full royal rank, were removed from her name. She remained a princess in title, the mother of a future king, but she was no longer, formally, a royal highness, and in the intricate grammar of the monarchy that omission spoke volumes. It meant that in the strict order of precedence, she would now, in theory, have to curtsy to royal figures far junior to her own son's future wives, to minor members of the family. It was a demotion encoded in initials, and it was widely felt, then and since, to be a small and pointed cruelty, a last quiet reminder from the institution of exactly where its power lay and where hers did not. There is a terrible symmetry in those lost initials, and it reaches all the way back to the beginning of the story. This marriage had begun, on Diana's own account, with initials, with a bracelet engraved G and F that she said she found 2 weeks before the wedding, 2 letters that told her a third person was already present. And it ended with initials too, with 3 letters taken away from her, the H, the R, and the H, the last mark of the rank her marriage had brought her. She had entered the marriage reading another woman's initials as a warning, and she left it stripped of her own. The girl who had married into the House of Windsor at 20 was, at 35, no longer a royal highness, keeping her title and her rooms and her children, and handing back the 3 letters that had meant she truly belonged. For all that she had lost, Diana in 1996 was, in one sense, freer than she had been at any point in her adult life. The marriage that had made her ill was over. The performance she had been conscripted into at 19 was finished. She was still the most famous woman in the world, still adored by the public, and now unbound from the institution that had constrained her for a decade and a half. Those who knew her describe a woman finding, at last, a measure of independence and purpose, no longer required to stand beside a husband in a marriage that was a fiction, no longer obliged to perform a happiness she did not feel for the benefit of the cameras. The fairy tale had been dismantled, publicly and painfully, and out of its wreckage the woman herself had, for a brief moment, walked free. There is a fitting silence in the fact that the terms of the settlement were sealed. The marriage had begun as the most public event on earth, watched by 750 million people, and it ended in a set of financial arrangements that were never disclosed, kept private by the very institution that had made every other part of the union a spectacle. The palace, which had staged the wedding for the world, drew a discreet curtain across the divorce, releasing no figures and confirming nothing, so that the true price of the ending remains unknown to this day. It was, in its way, the last act of image management in the whole long performance. The beginning had been shown to everyone. The ending was shown to no one. And the woman at the centre of it, who had spent 15 years unable to keep the smallest thing private, left the marriage inside a silence the institution chose, on terms the public was never allowed to see. That freedom lasted almost exactly 1 year. It is one of the cruelest facts in a story full of them that Diana had barely a 12-month of life beyond the end of her marriage, that the independence she had fought so hard and paid so dearly to win was granted to her for so short a time. The divorce was made absolute on the 28th of August, 1996. What happened almost a year later, at the very end of the following summer, turned the whole story from a marriage that had failed into a life that was cut off, and it ensured that the ending of Diana's story would not be resolution or recovery, or the quiet later years she might have had, but rupture, sudden and total, in a tunnel in Paris. Chapter 15. A year, almost to the day. Almost exactly a year after the divorce, the story ended not in resolution, but in a Paris tunnel. On the 31st of August 1997, Diana, Princess of Wales, died in a car crash in the Pont de l'Alma tunnel in Paris. She was 36 years old, the woman who had been the most photographed person on Earth, who had married the heir to the throne before 750 million witnesses, who had endured 15 years of a marriage staged for the cameras and had finally walked free of it, was gone in a single night, almost exactly a year after the divorce that had released her. The suddenness of it broke something in the country that has never entirely healed. What followed was a display of public grief without modern precedent in Britain. The gates of Kensington Palace, the home that had been the divided marital residence and had become Diana's own, disappeared beneath a sea of flowers laid by ordinary people who had never met her, and yet felt, in their thousands and then their millions, that they had lost someone they knew. The bouquets piled meters deep against the railings. The queues to sign the books of condolence stretched for hours through the London streets. A nation that had watched her walk up the aisle at 19 now mourned her at 36 with an intensity that startled even those who had loved her, and that the institution she had married into was slow, at first, to understand or to match. The image that fixed the loss forever was the funeral, and at its heart were two small figures. Her sons, Prince William and Prince Harry, then 15 and 12 years old, walked behind their mother's coffin through the streets of London in front of a watching world, in a silence broken only by the sound of the cortege and the weeping of the crowds. The two boys who had been born into the fiction, raised inside the staged marriage, loved by both parents across the corridor that divided them, now walked in public behind the body of the mother who had fought so hard to give them something more ordinary than the life she herself had been handed. It was the human cost of the whole story, made visible in two children on a long walk they should never have had to take. Diana's death did something lasting to the monarchy, and it did it precisely because of everything that had come before. The public grief was so vast and so pointedly warmer towards Diana than towards the institution that had constrained her, that it forced a reckoning the palace could not avoid. The relationship between the crown and the public, and between the crown and the press, was permanently altered by those September days, and it froze, for years, any prospect of a public role for Camilla, the third person in the marriage, whose name was now bound, in the public mind, to the unhappiness of the woman the whole country was mourning. The institution had outlasted the marriage. It was not at all clear, in the autumn of 1997, that it would easily outlast Diana's death. The grief of those days was, in a sense, the public delivering its verdict on the whole long story of the marriage. For 16 years, the country had watched the machine and the woman, the institution and the girl it had chosen, and in the week of her death, the country made unmistakably plain where its heart lay. The flowers were for her. The tears were for her. The warmth that the monarchy had spent centuries cultivating flowed, in that week, to Diana and away from the throne, and the palace found itself, for a time, dangerously out of step with the mood of the people it depended upon. The public had sided with the woman against the machine, decisively and in its millions, and it had done so at the very moment the machine could least afford it. The institution that had kept a marriage upright for a decade to protect its own image now faced a public that blamed that same institution, at least in part, for the unhappiness of the woman it was mourning. It was the closest the modern monarchy had come to a genuine crisis of affection, and it was the direct legacy of everything the marriage had been made to conceal. And underneath the national grief lay the simple, private tragedy of a life cut off before its time. Diana was 36 years old. She had spent almost half of her adult life inside a marriage staged for the cameras, and she had won her freedom from it at enormous cost, only to be granted barely a year to live in that freedom before it ended in a Paris tunnel. Whatever she might have become in the years she did not get, whatever peace or purpose or ordinary happiness the woman herself might finally have found, was taken away in a single night. The girl who had been chosen at 19 for her softness, who had been starved and silenced and stripped of her rank, who had fought the machine with the only weapon she had, and had, in the end, largely won the country to her side, did not live to see her sons grow, or to write whatever third act her extraordinary life might have held. The story does not end with her free and vindicated. It ends with her dead at 36, and a nation buried in flowers, and 2 boys about to walk behind a coffin. That is the true measure of what the whole performance had cost. The setting of the ending carries its own dark meaning, and it connects to the deepest current in the whole story. Diana had spent her adult life pursued by cameras. The fame that had made her the most valuable asset the monarchy possessed had also made her the most hunted woman on earth. And the same modern machinery of scanners and tabloids and relentless pursuit that had stripped her marriage bare in the tapes and the headlines was present in the form of the pursuing paparazzi at the very end. The forces that had turned her private life into public property for 16 years were there in the Paris night. The story that had begun with 750 million people watching a wedding ended with a woman fleeing the cameras into a tunnel and not coming out the other side. So the marriage of Charles and Diana reached its final, terrible full stop, not in the divorce court, but in a Paris tunnel a year later, with 2 boys walking behind a coffin and a country buried in flowers. The girl of 19 who had believed she was stepping into a love story was dead at 36. But the story itself was not over, because an institution outlasts the individuals inside it, and the institution had one more turn still to take. The performance the machine had maintained around the marriage had a final act left to play, and its ending would be the strangest reversal of all, because the third person in the marriage, the woman whose initials Diana said she had found on a bracelet before the wedding, was not finished. In time, she would wear a crown. Chapter 16. The third person wore the crown. The institution that staged the marriage waited out the outrage and ended by crowning the very woman Diana had named. In the years after Diana's death, something happened slowly and with great care, and it completed the inversion that the whole story had been building towards from the start. The institution, which had absorbed the collapse of the marriage and then the shock of Diana's death, set about a patient rehabilitation of the very relationship that had helped to destroy the fairy tale. Charles and Camilla were, over years, gradually brought back into public view, first apart, then together, then as an acknowledged couple, in a careful campaign designed to let the country grow used to what had once been unthinkable. And on the 9th of April, 2005, they married. It was a civil ceremony at Windsor, followed by a service of prayer and dedication at St. George's Chapel, a wedding arranged with all the delicacy that the marriage of a divorced and remarried heir to the throne, a man who would one day govern the Church of England, required. Then came the final reversal, the one that gives this story its coldest ending. On the death of Queen Elizabeth II in September 2022, Charles became king, and Camilla became queen. In May 2023, she was crowned beside him. The third person in the marriage, the woman Diana had named as the third of them, the woman whose initials Diana said she had found engraved on a bracelet 2 weeks before her wedding, ended the story anointed and crowned the Queen of the United Kingdom. And Diana, who had walked up the aisle of St. Paul's at 20 before 750 million people, lay on a small island at Althorpe, the Spencer seat where her story had begun, in the family ground of the house she had left as a girl to become a princess. The 2 sons carried the story forward into the present, and they carried it in very different directions. William and Harry, the children raised inside the staged marriage, took strikingly different paths in their relationship with the institution that had shaped their parents' lives. One bound ever closer to the crown as its future, the other stepping away from it. Their diverging courses are a living legacy of the marriage that made them, the private cost of the fiction still working itself out, a generation on, in the choices of the two boys who once walked behind their mother's coffin through the silent streets of London. The coldest lesson of the whole story is in that final reversal, and it is a lesson about the endurance of institutions. The marriage collapsed. The tapes broke. The confessions were given. Diana died, and the country turned against the palace in its grief. Any of it might have seemed, at the time, like a mortal wound to the monarchy. And yet the institution absorbed every one of these blows, waited, adjusted, and endured, until the passage of years had done its work, and the once unthinkable had become the ordinary fact of the official record. The woman who had been named as the third person in the marriage was rehabilitated, married, and in time crowned, and the country that had wept for Diana came, by degrees, to accept it. That is what institutions do. They outlast the individuals who suffer inside them. They can afford to be patient in a way that no single human life can, because they do not die, and so they simply wait for the outrage to cool and the memories to soften and the impossible to become the settled truth. The marriage was a tragedy for the two people inside it, and most of all, for the youngest and least protected of them. For the institution, it was a storm to be weathered, and the institution weathered it, and emerged with its heir on the throne and the third person crowned beside him. What, in the end, is the truth this marriage reveals? It is a truth about institutions and about the price they will make individuals pay to protect an image. Charles and Diana were mismatched, joined by a machine that wanted a suitable bride more than it wanted a happy couple. But the deeper cruelty was never simply that they did not love each other. The cruelty was that they were kept married in public for a decade, long after the marriage had ended in private, because the crown had sold their union to the world as a fairy tale and could not be seen to have been wrong. The separate bedrooms, the messages carried by servants, the staged tours, the briefing wars, the Prime Minister at the dispatch box insisting a dead marriage was merely resting. All of it existed to protect not the two people, but the picture of them. The performance mattered more than the people, and the person placed at the very center of the performance, the youngest, the softest, the least protected of them all, paid the most. There is a second truth here too, about visibility, and the whole scale of the story keeps proving it. This was the most watched marriage in human history, and almost nothing that mattered about it was ever visible while it happened. 750 million people saw the dress and the balcony kiss. Not one of them was shown the shrinking waist, or the divided apartment, or the messages carried by servants, or the bracelet Diana said she found. Grandeur is the easiest thing on earth to broadcast, and the truth of a marriage is the hardest thing to keep hidden forever. When this fiction finally broke, it broke not quietly, but in stolen phone calls and a smuggled book and 2 televised confessions, because a lie sold to 750 million people can only ever collapse in public. Return, at the very last, to the 29th of July, 1981, and to the girl of 19 walking up the long aisle of St. Paul's in a dress with a train of 25 feet, before 750 million watching eyes, slipping on the names of the man beside her and searching the pews for one particular face. She believed she was walking into a love story. She was walking into a performance, one that would run for 15 years, cost her almost everything, and end with the woman she was watching for in the congregation seated one day upon a throne. The country was told, the entire time, that it was gazing at a fairy tale. What it was actually watching was a girl being handed to a machine, and the machine, in the end, kept its crown and gave her a grave. That was where it was all going. Diana said she knew it from a parcel 2 weeks before the wedding. It took the rest of the world 15 years to see what she had seen in a single instant, and by the time it did, she was already gone. If you want the history of the crown told without the fairy tale over it, subscribe to Silenced Crown for the next one. And tell me in the comments, do you think Diana ever really had a chance inside that marriage? Or was the ending decided the moment the palace chose her? And say where you are watching from.